We have a universe that is fine-tuned for life. We have a rare Earth and a remarkable privileged planet. But this is only a fraction of the ingredients needed for life itself. Paul Davies reminds us that we must take this further, as he says that there are two basic requirements for complex life. The first is an Earth-like planet. That's what we've looked at so far in these podcasts. But the second is what he calls the genesis of life. In his book, The Eerie Silence, he says this: the fact that a planet is habitable is not the same as saying that it is inhabited. The deeper, the infinitely greater challenge than finding a planet that's habitable is the challenge of the origin of complex life. That's the subject of our podcast today, the complex cell. Failte go good news for Armagh. This is the podcast that looks at the big questions of the universe and of our hearts. There is something intuitive to us that this world in which we live in is designed. Now, we're told to fight it, but that is hard when we're confronted with such complexity that outstrips anything that we can fabricate ourselves. Man has always noticed this and naturally inferred upwards to some designer. Suppose you find a watch on the ground, says William Paley. The watch must have had a maker who formed it for the purpose, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. Every manifestation of design which exists in the watch exists in the works of nature. The difference on the side of nature is that of being greater or more, and that in a degree which exceeds all computation. That's what William Paley famously said. Now, simply put, he says that the sheer intricacy and the irreducible complexity of that watch in front of him intuitively makes him think upwards to an intelligent. And it naturally implies the existence of a watchmaker. Now, although Paley has been much maligned for the simplicity of his idea, it seems to me that there's a power to his argument. It has convinced many, and that arguing power still continues to nag at the back of the faithful atheist's mind. How is this universe so finely tuned and complex? In his book, Dennis Alexander tells of a lady in his church who became a Christian from a completely atheistic background. She had become convinced that there must be a God while sitting through a standard university biochemistry lecture, hearing the amazing story of how 2 meters, about 6 foot, of DNA are packed into a single cell. Do you see that power to convince, that gut feeling that when we see complexity, we look upward? Jean Mayers, who is a computer scientist, she said this: we are deliciously complex at the molecular level. There is still a metaphysical, magical element. It is like we were designed. There's a huge intelligence out there. I don't see this as being unscientific. Others may, but not me. Additionally, Dr. Alan Sandridge, the American astronomer who determined the first reasonable, accurate values for the Hubble constant and the age of the universe, in discussing his conversion to Christianity at the age of 50, he said this. He said the world is too complicated in all of its parts and its interconnections to be chance alone. I am convinced that the existence of life, with all its order and each of its organisms, is simply too well put together. I think they're right, but you see this power to convince. Life seems to be designed, but in a scientific world, it appears that you have to fight against that impulse. That seems to become problematic when people describe the universe. Like, you listen to biologists and cosmologists try to find words to illustrate this intricacy. Cells are referred to as mini cities, full of complexity. Proteins are said to be mini machines. The universe is said to be fine-tuned, and DNA is like a computer software language. Like, all of these descriptions of life seem to point to something or someone behind the curtain. A city is planned out. Machines are manufactured. Dials are tuned. And language originates in minds. But we're told to resist this, to push back at this impulse as if it is something primitive and archaic. We cannot allow the divine foot in the door. Or when men speak of laws that just describe the forces and things around us, but they have no power or mind in themselves. but they are given almost divine intelligence, ingenuity, and ability. So the very famous statement, because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself. Or when biologists say evolution will find a way, or it's not blind luck, it's chance and necessity. It seems that Richard Dawkins' blind watchmaker that he wrote about is given eyes, is given ears, and is given a mind. Now, it is true that certain levels of complexity can develop under forces like a tunnel of water or a tornado or a whirlpool, but no force can create complexity and order on the level that we are now about to look at. It is a different degree altogether. Like a star is formed through the gravitational pull, and although filled with power, it is not alive. We, on the other hand, are alive, and complexity fills us, and there's a wealth of difference there. Now, I'm a visual learner, and so you should Google yourself Drew Barry and watch some of his amazing animations describing the process of proteins working together and being made. Or you should Google a lecture by Ron Veal, or else look up neutrophil, chasing down bacteria. And when you see, for example, that neutrophil, it's just a tiny speck of matter. It's invisible to the naked eye, so small that 100 of them could be lined up across the top of a pen. But it's seemingly endowed with intention and agency to hunt, like a cat and chasing a mouse, or like some kind of biological Pac-Man. And to any thinking person, it startles you. Like, it senses the chemical aroma of the bacterium and crawls in a specific direction to hunt it down. Like, these skills are remarkable at any time, but when we find them on the molecular level, we sit back in a kind of an awe at the miracle of biology. Now, understanding, and I'll say this, understanding how this happens doesn't take away from the wonder of it or from the impression of design, any more than understanding how a Lamborghini is made takes away from the thrill of it and the fact that it was designed by Marcello Grandini. If anything, understanding how it works makes us appreciate the genius of Marcello, and it certainly doesn't give me the right to then take him out of the equation altogether. I was talking to one of my friends who had recently come to faith, and I asked him, how would you try and convince people in God? Without hesitation, he said, show them nature. The point is that there is convincing power when we study the world around us. And maybe you felt this. It leaves us in awe. It is intuitive to us. It's built into us, and it is hard to shake. So eminent physicist and philosopher John Polkinghorne asks, so where is this perceiving design in nature 2 centuries after William Paley? In short answer, he said, it's alive and well. And it seems to me if we throw off Paley's argument too quickly, we might lose out, because if there is a designer, if there is a watchmaker, then design just might be part of his grand evidence built into this universe for us. Now, if you've ever looked at a cell under a microscope, you will have seen a world of complexity. It's like one of those aerial drone shots of a city where you see all of the transport systems with its vast network of roads and railway tracks and even air routes. You can see production and destruction of buildings. You can see a multitude of pieces working together to grow, multiply, and develop the city itself. It's a dazzling sight to behold. Now, you take a simple cell and you put it under a high-powered electron microscope, and you will see something very similar. It is a city-like complex structure with production, destruction, transport, and exchange of information, with all parts working together in an exact dance-like symmetry. Professor Paul Davies, in his book Origin of Life, says this. He says that the living cell is the most complex system known to man, vastly more complicated than the most complicated ballet. The dance of life encompasses endless molecular performers in coordination. These complex cells, I want us to say, are the basic unit of life. Everything is made of them. For all organisms, regardless of their size or complexity, emerge from a cell. They come, like cells, come in incredibly different shapes and sizes. Most of them are too small to be seen with the naked eye, and they are truly minute. Like, so for a bacterium that can infect the bladder could be lined up 3,000 of them abreast on 1 millimeter gap. Other cells are immense. If you had an egg for breakfast, the yolk is just one cell. In our bodies, there are individual nerve cells that reach from the base of your spine all the way to the tip of your big nose. That's about a meter long. They are made up of trillions of atoms, representing the complexity of a jumbo jet and more, all packed into the space less than a millionth of the volume of a typical grain of sand. But unlike any jumbo jet, unlike any nanotech, this wondrous entry has an amazing ability. It can replicate itself. This is a phenomenal aspect of a cell's makeup. And biochemist Michael Denton, in his book Miracle of the Cell, he says this: here is an infinity machine with seemingly magical powers. In terms of compressed complexity, cells are without peer in the material world, actualized or imagined, and there is likely far more complexity still to uncover. So even one of the earliest of cells found was discovered. It was discovered not far from the town of Headland in Australia, and people dismiss it as primitive, but it's not. It's massively complex. That's one of the first cells ever found. Cells are incomparably diverse in form, and yet they appear supremely fit to fulfill their role as the basic unit of biological life. E. coli, that tiny organism in our guts right now, is breaking down and digesting the food we eat. You know, cells can move in many diverse ways. I thought this was really cool. So E. coli travels by a propeller-like action called a thing called the bacterial flagellum that we'll actually look about later on. Others move by a beaten action, like for example, cilia. Some even creep and crawl. It's amazing what's happening in your body right now. Some cells can sense electrical and magnetic fields and communicate via chemical and electrical signals. Some cells can case themselves in armor like skin, but all cells can replicate with seeming ease in an act beyond even the most complex human artifact. Now, I've given you a lot of information there, but I hope you start to see the complexity. But in short, cells can do almost anything, adopt almost any shape, and obey any order. They are perfectly adapted to their assigned task of creating a biosphere ripe for multicellular organisms like ourselves. And for all of these different forms and the many more that are found in the human body, every member of this fantastic zoo of diversity is built upon the same canonical design. So just like an atom consists of several components of an electron and protons and so forth that make up the whole, so too with biology's atom. So in reading the current writers, as I try to do, most, if not all, divide the cell into three features that are crucial to its makeup. So the cell wall, and secondly, its energy production, and then thirdly, its gene. And I want to think about these three things quickly. So let's think first of all about the cell wall, what I'll call the intricate skin. It's a critically important part of the cell is the skin or the membrane. Although just 2 molecules thick, this outer membrane forms a flexible wall or barrier that separates each cell from the hostile outside. This barrier is crucial to protect the cell and to give a safe setting for its processes to take place within it. Now, in the same way that you could not survive without skin, no cell could survive without a membrane. It's not simple. This outer wall is actually really complex, and it carries out numerous functions that makes it uniquely suited to fulfill this crucial role. First of all, it is remarkably thin. If a typical cell was expanded to the size of a pumpkin, its membrane would be thinner than a sheet of paper. And this remarkable thinness isn't just striking, it is essential to the cell function, allowing proteins, which on average are actually about the same thickness of the membrane, to span its width. And this is crucial for something that we're going to think about now, like transport. So this nicely segues to my next point, that it's not just remarkably thin, the skin is semi-permeable. That means the material can move in and out, but yet it still forms a border. No cell could survive without some sort of membrane that was relatively impermeable to the flow of material in and out. But yet, it does separate it from the external environment. So most cells have like special gates and pores. And honestly, Google this. It is amazing because it is so highly controlled, but yet the particles can pass in and out. So number one, it's remarkably thin. Number two, it's semi-permeable. But number three, it is self-organizing. This remarkable property allows the membrane, because of its intrinsic chemical nature, to form automatically around the outer surface of a cell. And this means that the membrane has the ability to self-repair. So it can readily close any hole or break that would allow the cell contents to diffuse away. I'll add a fourth one in here. It's not true of all cells, but some can be. It can be an electrical insulator. So electrical charge can be built up across the membrane, and the cells have a capacity to generate and maintain a charge across its membrane. So even when we look at the cell, it's not as simple as what some people will say a bubble is. Can we get a slight glimpse of the complexity of this essential microscopic skin? It is the right size, it is semi-permeable, and it is self-organizing. It is diverse, and it even can hold an electric potential. And this is essential. It is essential to the cell itself. So number one, the skin of the cell. Number two, the energy of the cell's metabolism. As I call it, energy from chemistry with little entropy. Now, cells and all life need energy. Energy to move, crawl, transport, or reproduce. And generating energy is thus a core aspect of cell life. Nothing lives without energy. So where does this energy come from? Well, let's take a step back for a second, because the Earth is not a closed system. And we get a lot of our energy from the sun's rays that are absorbed by plants, like through photosynthesis, to make glucose, which is a simple sugar. Now, that's important to get a hold of. Then, we as humans, we eat animals or eat plants, and we take this sugar into us. Now, our cells they have the ability to convert this glucose into energy. And if you want to Google this, this is called cellular respiration. This is the process of turning a glucose into a battery or a pot of energy. And the type of energy, or the name of the energy, is called ATP. It's like a battery. It's life's miracle fuel. It's a mini power pack, and it has a useful feature that it can actually keep and store the energy until it is needed. So how is this made? And this is where I can totally bore you. But I will say, do Google these things. I'll throw out the names, but Google them because they are remarkable. But I'm going to give you the dumbed down John version for myself more than you. So glucose needs to be changed into ATP. So from the sugar to the battery. It's like a currency exchange. Glucose needs to be changed into ATP so the body can use it. Now this happens in three broad steps. Firstly, there is something called glycolysis. And this happens in the cytoplasm of the cell. We're in 10 amazing chemical steps using 10 different enzymes. One glucose molecule is broken down into two pyruvate molecules, which produce two ATP molecules at the end. So we have 4 batteries ATP at this stage. Now I'm going to spare you the technical speak, but then we have, secondly, the Krebs or the citric acid cycle. The oxygen we breathe in is used to break down these molecules, and this happens in a compartment of the cell called the mitochondria, the engine of the cell. Now, through 8 more steps and 8 other enzymes, all of this action is used to produce further developments. Then we have step 3. Enter something called ETC and ATP synthase. And this is where you get the big payoff in producing energy. Now, ATP synthase is an amazing mini machine, and I couldn't get it across to you in this podcast. Google it, it is amazing. But the sum of that all is that the one original glucose molecule will produce 26 to 28 ATP batteries. And this is the chemistry of life. Now, you will produce your own body weight in ATP every day. And this is a wonder. Now, on one level, this is basic chemistry, but on another level, it is a complicated process from the stripping down of a glucose molecule to the changing, transporting and reusing the elements and forming energy through the action of proteins and enzymes. Like, listen, that is intricate. It is a miracle of efficiency and intricacy. And so we have the skin, then we have the energy source. But let's thirdly think about what I'll call the supercomposite shop floor, the cell gene. Now, when my second daughter was born, we had a couple of months of worry as she was the spit of my wife's cousin, Jeff. Now, thankfully, she grew out of that phase quickly, taking on the more near and beautiful genes of her mother and the impressive Hewitt genes, of course. Now, she's grown into a beautiful young woman, I'll tell you, who can dazzle you and get away with most things because of her cuteness. Now, there is a similarity through family. There's traits and there's characteristics that are similar, and even through generations. There's relatedness, is my point. Now, how does this happen? And the answer is the gene, the code that controls our hereditary. Now, we know this through the work of Gregor Mendel and his many experiments crossbreeding peas. He noticed the difference from generation to generation and postulated that an inherited characteristics are determined by the presence of physical particles which exist as a pair. Now, this was groundbreaking at its time and was developed by Walter Fleming, a German military physician, who observed for the first time a microscopic structure that looked like tiny threads within the nucleus of the cell. These threads are now what we call chromosomes, the physical structures that contain our genetic information. Every cell in our bodies contains these threads, and we have 46, 23 from our father and 23 from our mother. This genetic code carries the essential information of our cells and the information our cells need to replicate and to maintain itself and to produce the building blocks for our bodies to live and to thrive. Now, again, I'm a visual learner, so what I'll do is I'll attach in the description a video, a 2-minute video that you can go and you can check this out. Now, each of these microscopic threads is really a wound up, unbroken line of DNA. So you've got chromosomes and they are wound up threads and they are DNA. Now, if you remember the movie Jurassic Park, the zoologists were able, from a preserved mosquito, to take up sucked blood from its feasting on dinosaurs and read the genetic code, like an instruction manual, to build yourself a living, working T-Rex. These DNA strands can be exceptionally long for their minute size. So you take human chromosome number 2, which contains a string of 1,300 different genes. If you stretch it out, it would actually measure more than 8 centimeters in length. In fact, if you were to take all 46 chromosomes, that is the entire human genome, and stretch it out, it would come to almost 2 meters. But it is impressively well coiled up and kept together. So Paul Nurse, in his book, What is Life, explains. He says that through some miracle of packing, it all fits into a cell that measures no more than a few thousandths of a millimeter across. Now, what is more, if you could somehow join it together and then stretch out all the DNA coiled up inside your body, several million trails into a single slender thread, it would be about 20 billion kilometers long. That's long enough to stretch from the Earth to the Sun and back again 65 times. You tell me that that is not a sophisticated system of information. Now, this was visualized whenever Watson and Crick in 1953 won the race to understand the structure of this DNA molecule. And they saw it like a ladder that is twisted to form a spiral. This helix or double helix structure helped biologists understand how DNA both encoded the information and secondly was able to replicate itself. Now, the sheer wonder of this is that if you rip the ladder in two, each of the rungs of the ladder is a kind of letter or a code that contains the information for programming the body in 4 letters, A, C, G, and T, representing different nucleotide bonds. So if your body needed a certain protein, how would it go about making it? Now get ready for the complexity of the shop floor. The histone, firstly, that holds the DNA coil, that's like a protein that holds the DNA all coiled up, will release. So that little machines, I'm going to call proteins mini machines because that's what they are. Mini machines can attach themselves to it. They will split the ladder, they will read the code, they will transcribe the code. Now, obviously, the code needs to be copied. So amazingly, it is checked for errors by another little machine. And then it is transported by another little machine to a factory floor called a ribosome. And here the code is read 3 letters at a time called codons. And each of these 3 letters, for example, if you got TGT, represent one of 2 different amino acids. And this one is being called cytidine. And as the code is read, the different amino acids are added to form a chain like a pearl necklace. And we're not finished yet. In an amazing, precise way, this necklace of amino acids is then taken and folded in just the right way to form a new protein. So you have this end product of a new mini machine that can then be moved out of the cell to its assigned task. Now that is just immense. And this process of making these mini machines is going on inside you at high speed millions of times a day. And this is our microscopic super composite shop floor. From instruction to production, it is incredible. Can you see some of the extent of these 3 aspects of the cell? Now, I want to drive this home. One of the episodes of The Simpsons has Mr. Burns open a door in his house to a room, which is weirdly full of monkeys. And they're all sat in rows, both smoking and sitting working at typewriters. And he goes over to one of them and rips the sheet off the typewriter and reads it aloud. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It's obviously taken from Dickens, and it should be. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. Worth of times, worth of times. He starts shouting, "You stupid monkey," he screams. And the scene is funny because as for the monkeys to get anywhere near getting it right, the odds were just astronomical. Now think of what I've just talked through. Think of the process of replicating one protein from DNA. Think of the odds of getting the code right for each one of those amino acids that form the pearl necklace. Not just a sequence of 12 words like the monkeys, but a line of code 3 billion letters long. Now, Sir Fred Hoyle likened this happening by chance to a tornado blowing through a junkyard and forming a working 747 airplane. And I think he has a point. The sheer intricacy of this whole process is not just impressive, it's awe-inspiring. In fact, it is such an awe-inspiring complexity that it brings a flood of difficulties. How can this level of intricacy come to be? Now, I say difficulties, and I'm going to talk about a couple of difficulties. I don't mean proof texts for design. In my mind, they have not been answered scientifically yet. That's not to say that they could not be answered someday, but as yet they present formidable difficulties that prevents a slow, step-by-step climbing up Mount Improbable to arrive at the complex first cell. I'm not talking here about naturalistic evolution, but I'm talking about the complexity and the origin of life itself, the first cell. So 2 difficulties I'm going to think about, and the first is what has been called irreducibly complex, or irreducible complexity. I should say that, unfortunately, like Paley, the original proponent of this has been much maligned, and I do agree that there is a danger of concluding too readily that something is irreducibly complex. But it seems to me that even if Darwin himself saw this, that we should take account of it. Darwin wrote, he said, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down." He saw it, and I think we should take it on board at least. Now, let's think for a moment. I'll just give an illustration. If you think of a mousetrap and the different components to it. First, there's the flat wooden platform to which all the other parts are attached. Second, there's a metal hammer, which does the job of crushing the mouse. Lovely. Third, there's the spring. Fourth, there's the catch that releases when the mouse applies a slight bit of pressure. Fifth, there's the metal bar that connects the catch to and holds the hammer back when a trap is charged. Now, if you take away any of these parts, the spring or the holding bar or whatever, it is not like the mousetrap becomes half as efficient as it would be, or it only catches half as many mice. No, it doesn't catch any mice because it's broken. It doesn't work at all. So you have to have all of the pieces together there at once. And not only that, they have to all be matched together and have that special right relationship to each other. So you can see the principle. It's irreducibly complex. You can't take one bit out and then add it in later on. It has to all arrive at the same time and all have that relationship to each other at the same time. So let's think about the whole cell with its necessary three areas of the gene, its metabolism, and its membrane. And this is a massive problem in biology. So the geneticist, the esteemed geneticist, Paul Nurse, who, among many things, is the director of the Francis Crick Institute in London, and he shared a Nobel Prize in physiology, he neatly put it like this. But which came first? Replicating DNA-based genes, protein-based metabolism, or enclosing membrane? In today's living organisms, these three systems form a mutually independent system that only works properly as a whole. DNA-based genes can only replicate themselves with the assistance of protein enzymes. But protein enzymes can only be built from the instruction held in the DNA. How can you have one without the other? Then there's the fact that both genes and metabolism rely on the cell's outer membrane to concentrate the necessary chemicals, capture energy, and protect them from the environment. But we know that cells alive today use genes and enzymes to build their sophisticated membranes. It is hard to imagine how one of this crucial trilogy of genes, protein, and membranes could have come about on its own. If you take one element away, the whole system rapidly comes apart. So to understand how these three elements come together is to understand the origin of life, one man has said, because it is so difficult. Although this has become a new area of study in recent years, it yet remains the major area and the major mystery in biology. Because the sheer gulf between life and non-life, even in its simplest form, is exponential. So you compare a rock to an ordered structure, like a snowflake. But then you compare a snowflake with the tiniest bacterial cell that's a bursting miniature city made up of 100,000 million atoms, and its complexity outstrips anything of the snowflake, outstrips anything of the rock. So what I'm driving at today is, how does life start? How do you get this first cell? Now, in 1953, Stanley Miller, supervised by Harold Urey, conducted a very famous experiment trying to reproduce the first complex life on the primordial Earth. And he was able to make a couple of amino acids through a highly, I might say, designed environment. This is still pointed to as a proof text to the creation of life. But as any serious, well, not say serious biochemist, but honest biochemist will tell you, this is an exponential step away from actual life. It's one thing to create amino acids. It's another thing to have the right amino acids in the right place at the right time to combine together to form something. Now, there's no good explanation for how this kind of level of complexity has come to be. There are definitely theories about in the scientific community today for how life has developed, but not for how it has started. Some of these ideas seem, to me, a little like modern alchemy. There's a big gap in our understanding here, and that is true, and everyone will agree with this. So whether it's the clay surface or the tiny compartments in the early rock or the RNA first model, these ideas have weight and definitely should be investigated to conclusion. But it seems by each author's admission that I've read that this is thin theoretical ice. So David Berlinski says in his way, a great many people have concluded that when it comes to the origin of life, Hoyle's 747 junkyard is all that's being offered. So I think that we'll put it this way, it's definitely not Miller time yet. His experiment, in my judgment, is not viable for an explanation of the origin of life. So the first difficulty is irreducible complexity, but the second difficulty is the chicken and egg scenario. Which came first? So you've got the chicken that then laid an egg, or the egg that hatched to become a chicken. And there's a difficulty about which one comes first because they're actually dependent on one another, and so you can't have one without the other. So firstly, let's just look at a couple of examples. First of all, you've got the membrane or the gene. So even the simplest of cells has a complex membrane, and it is essential to give an environment that is safe to perform its work. So Anthony Latham says this, and he's talking about the first cells that have been found, and a lot of the time about these cells that they're talked about as very primitive, but they're not. And this is Anthony Latham's point. He says this: far too often I hear experts confidently postulate about the first cell's membranes. They knew that the first life had to have a protective coat to hold the DNA and all the incredibly sophisticated molecular machinery inside. Some, including Schoof, who he was the one that discovered this first cell, suggested that the first fledgling and replicating DNA was surrounded by a type of soap bubble. The membrane of a bacterium is, however, entirely different from simple soap in structure, and these first bacteria had the same dynamically complex cell membranes as modern ones do. The actual details of the membrane must be encoded for the DNA of the cell. It is a major problem for theorists of early life to imagine how the first DNA achieved such a code without having first the membrane around it. Such chicken and egg scenarios bedevil the understanding of early life. So what he's saying, which came first, this is a massive difficulty. The membrane to encase the gene, or the gene to code the membrane. Secondly, protein or DNA. It is very important in all of this to realize that although the DNA gives rise to proteins, the replication of DNA itself cannot proceed without the existence of a number of proteins. So Robert Shapiro, an acknowledged expert on DNA chemistry, he said this: that DNA holds the recipe for protein construction, yet that information cannot be retrieved or copied without the assistance of proteins. Stephen Mayer says this: in modern cells, DNA replication involves more than 30 specialized proteins to perform tasks necessary for building and accurately copying the genetic molecule. DNA needs these proteins to copy the genetic information contained in the DNA. But the proteins that copy the genetic information in DNA themselves are built from that information. You get that? This again poses what is, at very least, a curiosity, but more than that, a difficulty. The production of the proteins requires DNA, but the production of DNA requires proteins. Can you see the difficulty? Where does life come from? How does life originate? Complex genomes require reliable copying, and reliable copying requires complex genomes. Which came first? Can you see that there are difficulties here? Now, and we've looked at these two difficulties: irreducible complexity and the chicken and egg. Now, these are formidable hills to overcome, but I think there is something more insurmountable, and that is the enigma of information. Now, on one level, DNA and the whole genome can be understood as chemical entities, and this is true, but it only goes so far, because information is a different animal. Now, in Series 3 of Taskmaster, Greg Davies set the celebrities a task of popping a collection of balloons on a washing line. So the fastest to pop them wins. Now, there were two types of balloons. You got the normal round ones that everyone loves, but then you've got the long ones, the ones that no kid ever played with, or you just used them as swords to whack each other. Now, so as Al Murray walked up to the task, he kind of said in an offhand comment, that looks like Morse code. And he then proceeded to whack and wallop his way to complete in the task. Now, at the end of the task, it actually was revealed that he was right, that the balloons were arranged in Morse code. And the code said, pop one balloon to win. No one won. But think of that for a moment. Just dashes and dots conveyed by the balloons. Information was carried from the taskmaster's mind to the audience. Now, it is a strange thing to think about, that information itself is not physical, like mathematics. It's not physical. It's an invisible and non-material thing. The carriers of information, they are visible. So like the balloons, the dashes and dots, or like a pen writing on paper, it's physical. But information itself is invisible. So as you're listening to me, the electrical impulses in my brain move my mouth to speak, and the sound waves carry the information from my mouth to your ear via technology, of course. But from there, they are converted into electrical impulses and transmitted back to your brain. Now you have the information that originated in my mind, but nothing material has passed from me to you. The carriers have been material, but the information itself is non-material. So what about DNA? This code, is it information? Well, yes, every one of those letters, T, G, S, C, form a kind of a Morse code that conveys instructions. It is a kind of a language. So Bill Gates, in his book, The Road Ahead, wrote this, that DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created. Richard Dawkins has spoken about this. His book, A River Out of Eden, he describes DNA as a river of information. This DNA is a coded language containing the information that forms and designs all forms of life. And now this, I think, is where we can only look upwards. For this reason, when you see any kind of language, any kind of code, any kind of information like that, whether it's markings on a cave wall or a message written in the sand of the beach saying, marry me, or a digital code, we automatically think that there's an intelligence behind it. So where does this code come from? This is the real problem with just a naturalistic look at the universe. And so whenever you read the books on this, the writers get this. Like, so Paul Davies, for example, in his book, Demon in the Machine, he sees this. And the point that he makes through his book is that we need a new kind of physics to understand this idea, because our current method of study only works on the naturalistic level. And my point is this: does there come a point in our scientific search that naturalistic ways of understanding the universe just don't cut it? I think there is. And I think any time we see information, we automatically infer upward to a mind, to an intelligence. And should we not do the same when we see in code form the longest word ever recorded? I think we do. What this means is that the cell is not just complex in its physical features, but also at the level of information. So I think we need to rethink Paley's watch and update it. So on the other side of Silicon Valley's fence from Bill Gates, here's my Apple version. Now imagine if you're walking down a beach and you came upon an iWatch, and you pick it up and look at it and see the strap, the metal casing, you open it and reveal the circuitry and power source, and you say, boy, that looks complex. But then you take it home and you connect it to your computer and you discover another world of complexity. That it's not just a hardware product, but there is a software world that is line after line of code, the binary language written for the instructions of how the watch actually works. Can you see how this adds to the complexity of the hardware of Paley's watch? It's not just about the hardware of life. That complexity is found, the stars, the planets, the animals. Here, the cell, membrane, the metabolism, the flagellum, the cerium, all of these things. We can perceive design here, but it is not just in the hardware, it is in the software. A 3 billion letter long word. And this means what I am inferring is a little more than what Paley did. It is not based just in the natural design of things, but in what the nature of information is. David Berlinski says that it seems that molecular biology provides the first clear, first resonant answer to Paley's question. I think that's quite profound. Information naturally leads us to intelligence. And where does this information come from? Well, it seems to me that whenever you look to the complexity of the cell and the information it communicates, that life is more than the cell, it's more than the atom. At the biological level, information is more than cellular. It infers a mind, a watchmaker, and it's certainly this watchmaker doesn't seem to be blind. Now in 2001, when the human genome was first brought together and codified, the announcement was made on the front garden of the White House. The then President Bill Clinton said this. He said, "We can now read the language of God." Maybe so. It's almost as if the Creator has autographed every cell with a word so complex as to make us look upwards. I am tempted to say that if Bill Gates is right, and it is a software, who programmed it? It seems to me that Mr. Burns' chance-driven monkey room won't just cut it. Biophysicist Dean Kenyon, co-author of a definitive textbook on the origin of life, whose studies actually have led him to a conclusion that biological information is designed. He said this, "If science is based on experience, then science itself tells us that the message encoded in DNA must have originated from an intelligent cause." At the heart of this topic is the fundamental question of what is the origin of this complexity. This is Paley's and our question today. We're warned not to infer design, but I admit it is difficult in the face of such overwhelming complexity and the mystery of information that seems to transcend this physical world. Is complexity on this scale not always intertwined with intelligence? I think if there is a digital river out of Eden, then that may be a good place to look for its source. Slán go fóill.